Finishing all 7 steps in Lufel's Business Plan EX gives you 60 of this Artisan Mod Order piece. And by exchanging 60 of this, you get 1 Artisan Mod Order. In this video, we're going to discuss which character is worth spending your Artisan Mod Order on. So like I already mentioned, you need 60 of this to exchange, then you will get the Artisan Mod Order. And to use them is very simple. You go to your character section, go to the character that's 5-star weapon, let's say a cord, you click your weapon, you go to enhance, forge, then you will see the Artisan Mod Order here. That's how you use it. But who should you use it on? I'll actually rank top 5 characters. So at the number 5, I'm actually going to group all the DPS together into one ranking, because personally, in my opinion, you should invest in your supports more because they are used more often. DPS, you are really only going to use them in specific fights. For supports, you can put them in most teams. If you ask me which Mindscape should you focus on, my answer is also the same, focus on support. In fact, my core Mindscape is pretty much max. My Futaba Mindscape is also pretty much max aside for this one. Some stats increase which is not that important in my opinion. But anyways, at number 5, like I said, I'm ranking all the DPS together. If your DPS is very high awareness, maybe A6, maybe you well DPS, then giving them the Artisan mod is not a bad idea because it's going to make them do even more damage, right? If you're like free to play low spender and you have some DPS characters but only like A0 or A0R0, then I wouldn't really spend my Artisan mod, I think I'm just going to call them Artisan mod, on them. So I'm not going to actually go through like each of the weapons because there's a lot of DPS in this game, but I will talk about only one character, and I'm not going to say good things about this character because it's actually the character that I advise against spending your Artisan's mod on, and that is Mesa. The reason I even got his 5-star weapon is because I saw this increased pierce rate of rending damage by 25%. When I saw this, I was like, holy crap, 25% is a huge number, I should get the weapon. Well, yeah, it is a big number, but rending damage is only half of his damage, so half his damage doesn't get his pierce, so it becomes kinda useless. And you know what's even worse? This rending damage only applies to the highlight. What I mean is that, okay, let me explain what's rending damage again. Rending damage is basically damage you get, extra damage you do when you go into Reaper mode. At A0, you don't really go Reaper mode with Mesa because that for some reason does less damage. I also don't understand why, but it just does less damage. The only time you enter the Reaper mode is when you use the highlight, because for the highlight, you briefly enter the Reaper mode here and then you do damage. That's the only time the pierce rate for rending damage applies to Mesa. Only the highlight. Everything else doesn't even apply. If you have A6 Mesa, you are using the Reaper mode more, so you're going to transform more often. But even then, again, the pierce rate only applies to half the damage. Literally only half the damage of Mesa's entire kit gets the pierce rate, which means that you still need defense debuff anyways, so this pierce rate becomes useless. So again, this is the only weapon I don't really recommend getting, because the only buff you get is pretty much the bleed damage increase, 7.5%. Okay, 7.5% is a decent amount, but it's only one thing. Every other like 5-star weapon buffs like 2 things. Unfortunately, Mesa fans, the 5-star weapon is not that good. Every other DPS is pretty safe to use your Artisan's mod on, because they give you a decent buff. And just to remind everybody again, all number weapons increase everything that's not the first sentence. You can see the R1, R3, R5, they all increase the pierce and the bleed damage. R2, R4, R6, they all improve the attack damage, the attack percent. So typically, the more impactful upgrade is going to be the all numbers. In this video, we are mostly going to talk about R1 weapon, because I'm sure most of you only have R0 weapon and is looking to decide which one to go to R1. Excluding all the DPS in the game, all the assassins, all the sweepers, there's only 4 other characters, 4 other 5-star limited characters that are not DPS. So just nice, we're gonna continue ranking top 4 to top 1. And number 4, the 5-star weapon is gonna be Samoko. Unfortunately, I don't have the weapon. I actually do want it, mainly because the defense debuff here 12% is pretty helpful. Because the reason why I rank it number 4 and not higher is because from R0 to R1, you only buff, I think we can change to this. You only buff damage, skill damage and healing from 18.5 to 24. Not really relevant because it doesn't buff your team at all, it just do a bit more damage and do a bit more healing. And then you increase damage taken from 8.5 to 11%. That's all. Stacks up to 2 times, so it's like 5%. increase the damage, which is super low. So R0 to R1, you get only a 5% increase in the damage taken. Unfortunately, the defense debuff here doesn't improve with the weapon. Honestly speaking, I wouldn't recommend duping the weapon, but I do recommend getting the weapon, which I want to get hopefully soon when she reruns or something. And number 3 is going to be Futaba. Futaba's 5-star weapon is decent. It's just a damage buff. And honestly, the damage buff isn't anything crazy. It's an attack buff to allies, and then a bit of crit damage taken up. Then when you go to R1, you get a bit more buffs here. So you get a 3% more attack, and you get a 4.6% crit damage increase. It's a very small amount, honestly. One benefit of Futaba is that she's a navigator. She will use in pretty much every team. So since you're using her for every team, then that means the weapon buff is gonna be more valuable. But still, it's a very small increase. It's only a 3% attack buff and a 4.6% crit damage buff. I wouldn't recommend duping the weapon for Futaba because the top two are just better. Assuming you have the 5-star weapon, of course. And number 2, you guys are probably going to be shocked. It's actually going to be Cord. I'm sure some of you would think that I will put Cord as number 1. Of course, weapon is pretty good. What it does is that it fills the highlight gauge by 40% at the start of battle. This is very good because with Trust and Prosperity, it means that you can highlight on the first turn on the 4th faction. And on top of this highlight gauge increase, the core star, which is the skill 2 buff, is slightly higher. And then every time you use a highlight, the skill 2 buff is going to increase a bit more, up to 3 times. So a total of 30% here for core star buff. But the main highlight is the highlight gauge. Now if you go to R1, you will increase the highlight gauge to 52%. This means that you can highlight on the 3rd action instead of 4th action. And then of course your core star, your attack buff, everything increases. So it's a 9% increase for everything, extra 9%. Not a big buff honestly, but I think the more important one is the highlight gauge. You're probably wondering, if the highlight gauge increase is pretty good, then why is Cord only number 2? Okay, let me do a little bit of highlight tutorial, I guess, if I call that. So this is a typical highlight rotation. You use a DPS highlight here, on the 2nd turn, and on the final action. Then in between, you're going to use 2 more highlights. This is the typical rotation. If you have Cord with R0, a highlight is going to be turn 1 of the 4th action. Then when you highlight here, the next highlight is going to be here. Then the next highlight should be around here. But the thing is, if you highlight here, that means the next highlight is technically here, but you usually don't highlight here. You just keep until here to use the Cord highlight, then use the DPS highlight. So this is with R0, the 5-star weapon. Typically, even with R0, sometimes you don't even highlight here. Sometimes you just use the typical highlight rotation here. Because when you compare typical and R0, it's still 4 highlights total. You know, the only time when R0 weapon, the highlight gauge increase is useful is when you use a weakness hit. Because if you didn't know, hitting a weakness gives you 4% charge to your highlight gauge. So you will be able to highlight here instead. Then if you highlight here, you can highlight here. Then you can highlight here, highlight here, highlight here. It becomes a 5 highlight rotation. So it's a slight buff. But the only condition is that you need to hit a weakness hit so that your highlight gets moved forward. With R1, you do get the highlight here, your 3rd action. So you don't need any weakness hits anymore. So you will get it here. Which means you can do Cord highlight here, DPS highlight here, DPS highlight here, Cord highlight here. But the problem now is that nowadays you pretty much run Cord and Twins together. If you run Cord and Twins together, you don't highlight with Cord anymore, you highlight with Twins here. So if you highlight with Twins here, then we remove the Cord highlight here. The next highlight is going to be here, right? Then we delete this one. Then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, no, doesn't work. You have to highlight here. If you highlight here, you delete this, then you cannot Cord highlight here. Because if you Cord highlight here, the highlight is already here. Right, I hope I'm explaining this right. It's a little bit difficult to explain, but try and visualize. If you Cord highlight here, you can only highlight here. Unless it's like A6 Cord or A4 Cord or something. But I'm talking about low awareness. You can only highlight here. Which means that you cannot use Twins highlight here. Of course, the exception is when you're not using Twins at all. Or you're not using any other support highlights. If you're going to use Cord highlight, then Cord highlight, you can Cord highlight here. But typically Twins highlight is going to be better if you're running both Cord and Twin together. So what this means is that the highlight gauge buff from the 5-star weapon is not as impactful. If Twins didn't exist, then I actually would put Cord as number 1. But now that the Twins exist, it becomes a bit difficult to recommend Cord weapon dupe. However though, if you're going for R2 to R3, then I would recommend, because you can highlight here now. So basically every even number you increase the action from here, 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 then here. If you highlight here, then you can DPS highlight here. So it kind of becomes like a typical rotation now. Now if you look at this R3, this is a typical one. is pretty much the same. The only difference is that you do a core highlight here. If you already have R2 core weapon, then I would recommend going to R3. Now for R5 is when you can highlight on the first action, which is cool, I guess. I don't really have much thing to say because the rotation is like the same anyways. I think the most impactful one is going to be R3 if you're gonna choose one. So going from R0 to R1, the highlight gauge increase isn't as impactful as it seems, because by the end of the day, the highlight rotation is gonna be like pretty much the same, not much difference. And on top of that, you do get some attack buff, 9% attack buff, which is nice, I guess, but nothing as crazy as our number 1. And if you go to R3 is where I would recommend the weapon. It's pretty good because you can now highlight on the second action, so you can actually have like a fixed rotation, the same typical rotation, but you can do an extra core highlight on the first turn. Let's go to number 1. If you haven't guessed it yet, it's not other than our newer support, the Twins. Twins first weapon, I would argue, is one of the best in the game. The buff stat they give is quite insane. Now, what's even more insane is what they get at R1. Just now you see core was 9% attack only, right? And Futawa was only like 5% crit damage or something like that. What does the Twins get? From R0 to R1, you get a 30% increase to desire level. Okay, that's cool. You get an 8% increase to crit damage and 8% increase to damage dealt. That's insane. That's actually insane. So that's like 16% total. Then you compare that with Cord with only 9% attack. And just remember that crit damage is better than attack as a stat, as an offensive stat. It's a good buff. And Twins, of course, is a support that you're going to use very, very often because they are really good. So I would recommend going for their 5-star weapon. Now, which 5-star weapon would I pick to dupe? I'm not going to dupe any DPS because I value supports more. And the support weapon that I'm going to dupe is actually going to be the Twins. I'm going to listen to my own advice and dupe their weapon because I think their weapon is really good. They are very strong supports that is used very often. And I recommend it so much that I'll actually use it right here and right now.